I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future.
We're replacing the wild with the tame.
We need wild spaces. It is essential for us to begin to value these places intrinsically, and that nature has a right to exist regardless of human perception and interaction. But with the ever-increasing habitat loss and decrease in ecosystem services, perhaps assisting nature through rewilding can help. The rewilding method has 4 approaches to achieve conservation goals. These are trophic, Pleistocene, ecological, and passive rewilding. The 2 extremes are the trophic and the passive methods. Trophic interactions are feeding interactions between species. Trophic rewilding aims to restore ecosystem functions by reintroducing species that initiate top-down trophic interruptions. We are all familiar with the trophic rewilding of the wolf to Yellowstone National Park. In essence, rewilding is based on lower instances of human intervention. Therefore, it hasn't achieved the maturity and respectability of traditional species conservation theory. Rewilding is clearly different to traditional translocation conservation in both philosophy and methods. Traditional species conservation efforts use the method of translocation. Conservation translocation is simply the deliberate movement of organisms from one site for release in another. Translocations consist of reinforcement and reintroduction within a species' indigenous range, or introductions outside indigenous range. This is also known as in situ and ex situ conservation. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, created guidelines for reintroduction and other conservation translocations. They have been developed to be applicable to the full spectrum of conservation translocations. They are based on principle rather than example. Any translocation will impact and be impacted by human interests. Social, economic, and political factors must be fundamental to translocation viability and planning. Translocation requires a multidisciplinary team with technical and social expertise representing all interests. This rigidity is vastly different to the rewilding approach. Due to the regimented planning in theory, the guidelines are simple and direct. It is easy to assess a conservation project and determine what kind of conservation efforts are occurring and if it meets the criteria for translocations. This, however, is interesting, as so much of our learning has focused on how complex and dynamic environmental systems are. This is where rewilding is perhaps better suited. The hands-off style is more lenient and appropriate. But can rewilding be assessed accurately with the IUCN's guidelines anyway? Both methods are essentially trying to achieve the same outcome. If rewilding can be assessed with the guidelines, perhaps it would be more accepted in conservation research and implemented more frequently. On October 4, 2020, 26 Tasmanian devils were released in the Barrington Tops National Park in New South Wales. This is the first time the species has been on the mainland in 3,000 years. Although the program aims to establish a new population of the endangered species, the main hope is that, as apex predators, the devils will regenerate the ecosystem. The devils will hopefully reduce numbers of feral cats and foxes, allowing native species to thrive. This is an example of trophic rewilding. The devils will be closely monitored but largely left uninterfered with, aligning with the passive philosophy of rewilding. Let's assess the Tasmanian devil case study against the guidelines. The program easily fulfills the first 2 requirements, as the release was intentional and will both improve status and restore ecosystem function. However, it is evident that the rigidity of the guidelines makes it hard to apply to the dynamic goals of rewilding. Was the release of the Tasmanian devil within indigenous range? The answer is time-dependent and results in 2 different outcomes. The Tasmanian devil was indigenous to the mainland thousands of years ago. This lens produces the reintroduction definition of translocation. However, with a contemporary lens, the species was reintroduced to a new area. This shifts the result to assisted colonization, or ecological replacement. Additionally, in situ and ex situ are foundations of conservation management. Due to the ambiguity surrounding the devil's natural habitat, it is difficult to determine which of these categories the rewilding of the devils falls under. Braverman's emphasis is on species' natural surroundings. Although these devils were captive bred, they are being released into natural surroundings, and this is evident of in situ conservation. The Tasmanian devil rewilding case indeed fits within the guidelines. However, the dynamic nature of the program yields different definitions. With 2 more releases planned, it is exciting to see how the devil project will go. There was another project to rewild the Tasmanian devil on Maria Island, which has been successful. However, Maria Island is free of dingoes. The devils disappeared from the mainland because they became outcompeted by dingoes. Section 3 of the guidelines state that there should be strong evidence that the threat or threats that caused any previous extinction have been correctly identified and removed or sufficiently reduced. Interestingly, Barrington Tops is one of the few remaining places in New South Wales with a dingo population, although small. There is a lack of material available discussing the impacts this will have on the project. I can only assume that the size of the population was deemed reasonable, and having 2 Indigenous apex predators will be beneficial to the ecosystem. On that note, conservation in the future will be less likely to be so rigid and based on targets and objectives. It will be more about if and when to intervene, and we need further research and criteria to facilitate these decisions. The rewilding of the Tasmanian devil in New South Wales will hopefully begin this process and see more of Australia become wild. I hope this presentation has assisted with your learning, and I look forward to seeing your insight in the discussion forums this week. I found rewilding to be a great concept to explore. Thanks, guys.